The Space Force Wants You, with special guest Matt Lohmeier. Episode 39 of the Michigan UFO Sightings and Paranormal Encounters podcast. Welcome to the Michigan UFO Sightings and Paranormal Encounters podcast. Coming to you from the glacial dumping grounds known as the Michigan Basin. I'm Michelle.
And I am Wayne.
And we are a Michigan-based husband and wife educator and podcasting duo that after having a UFO sighting in March of 2018, have started to examine UFOs and other paranormal topics within Michigan and beyond.
Topics include UFOs, the paranormal, conspiracy theories, ghosts, alternative history and archaeology, cryptids, and all things strange and paranormal. So sit back, grab a drink, and come along with us on this journey down the paranormal rabbit hole. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hello, everyone.
And here we are, episode 39, and this is going to be an awesome episode. We're going to have on the very controversial former Lieutenant Colonel of the Space Force, Matt Lohmeier.
Cool dude.
Very cool dude, very smart. And I'm glad he decided to jump on the escalator going down the rabbit hole. And yes, we are the only podcast that has our own personal escalator down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, hopefully we run into him along the way, on our journey down the escalator.
Yeah, well, there goes Michelle again. She just zipped down the rail again.
I'm sliding down the handrail.
Yep. All right, well, welcome everybody. We're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about where you can find us.
So, well, first of all, you can find us on YouTube. Search us out by typing in Michigan UFO Sightings and Paranormal Encounters podcast. It's all one word. Fortunately, once you type it in a few times, it'll show up for you.
No kidding.
Because there's no spaces.
So if you have a story you would like to tell, we would like to talk to you. You can reach out to us at mi.ufo.podcast@gmail.com. Send us a brief summary of your experience, and we will contact you to discuss things further and try to get you or your story on the podcast.
And don't forget, if you want to rock some of that latest swag, head on over to the online store. So you can find that at miufopodcaststore.online. Just look to the show notes for that link. And don't forget to check out our Patreon page if you would like to support the podcast there. It is patreon.com/MIUFOSPEP where you can sign up. We can't wait to give you a shout out for all of your support. Speaking of Patreon, we still need to give that shout out to our good friend and Patreon, Ed S., for supporting the podcast.
And also, we would like to give a shout out to Hava H for still being a supporter of the podcast. This podcast exists because of help by people like you. And don't forget, share us out, people. If you don't want to join our Patreon and buy any swag or anything like that, just share us out. Share us with your friends, family, anybody to help grow the podcast.
Tell your family and friends about us.
Absolutely. Now, they might think you're a little crazy listening to a podcast about UFOs and paranormal stuff. But, hey, they might enjoy it.
Guess what I'm drinking, Wayne?
You're drinking the same thing I'm drinking.
Yeah, coffee. It's late in the day. We're still drinking coffee.
Yeah, considering we've been up since about 4:30 this morning.
Oh, that's every morning for me.
Absolutely. So you can, if you want to help support the podcast, buy us a cup of coffee. Just head on over to www.buymeacoffee.MIUFOPODCAQ. And we would love to be able to drink a cup of coffee and give you a shout out as well.
Just remember that you can find all the links listed in our show notes at the end.
Yep, and this is going to be the episode where I'm going to just put in one link, and that's going to be to our link tree. You click on that, and all of these links will show up in one place.
Yeah, it's a teacher for you.
Well, I don't want to crowd the show note things, and I know it's hard for people to read show notes on their phone because a lot of people listen to the podcast at work or while they're doing other things through their phone or while they're driving. So there's, I understand when I listen to a podcast, I'm not checking the show notes on my phone. So there'll just be a link tree there, and you can find everything there. Are you getting hungry, Michelle?
Yeah, a little bit.
I think a tasty steak rice bowl sounds pretty good right now. How about you?
I don't know. Might be some corned beef egg rolls.
Corned beef egg rolls. Ooh, how about some homemade raspberry cheesecake?
I don't know. That Snickers cheesecake was pretty tasty.
Or that chicken Florentine soup.
Why are we sitting here talking about food?
Because it's our good friends over at
New Boston Coney and Grill.
New Boston Coney and Grill. Jump in the car. Let's go.
Traveling near New Boston, Michigan? Hungry? Well then, you need to check out New Boston Coney and Grill tucked away at 37005 Huron River Drive. With daily specials, homemade soups and desserts, and a staff that makes you feel like family. You will not be disappointed. Give them a try for dine-in or carry-out at 734-606-5313. You can find their page, including their menu, on Facebook. Bon appetit!
Hey, Michelle, I think it's that time.
It's time for What's in the News.
Yes. What is in the news?
Well, from Big Country News, Prince Philip's UFO investigation could be released. Prince Philip's UFO investigation could be released following the death of Queen Elizabeth. The prince developed a fascination with aliens after a bricklayer reported a close encounter with extraterrestrial life at the home of Lord Louis Mountbatten, Philip's late uncle. But until now, his investigative work into UFO sightings in the UK has remained under wraps. Philip, who died in April of 2021 at the age of 99, has been credited with creating a so-called Royal X-Files on the subject of space and alien life. And the royal family are now facing calls for the investigation to be made public. The Daily Star newspaper reports. The work previously remained a secret until the reign of the Queen.
Well, that goes back to the point where I don't think over there in the UK they take this very seriously. Now, there's a lot of people over there that take it seriously, but the media and the government officials over there are kind of like our media and government officials back about maybe 10 years ago, where everything was an X-Files song or whatever, just to discourage the public and make them seem idiotic.
Nick Pope, the ex-Ministry of Defense official who was in charge of the UK government's UFO desk between 91 and 94, claims that Philip and Sir Peter Horsley, his ex-RAF associate, spent years investigating alien sightings. He said Philip kept an eye on developments, subscribed to UFO magazines and newsletters, and had witnesses interviewed. So there's that Phenomena magazine, because weren't they the biggest magazine over there?
Yeah, and I wonder if he was a listener of our podcast.
Well, you never know.
Mm-hmm.
He also claimed Philip's interest in the subject was deliberately kept under wraps during the reign of the late monarch, as it would have caused a stir.
Oh, so there you go. She didn't want anything to embarrass the throne, I'm sure.
Well, any attention that was drawn to Buckingham Palace was, completely taboo. Nick told History TV, this is highly sensitive. Here you have the Queen's husband investigating UFOs. Had the news got out, it would have caused a sensation. Now, Lord Mountbatten, who was assassinated in August 1979.
Good Lord.
That would be interesting to look into. And Prince Philip are said to have talked extensively about the possibility of extraterrestrial life. And Richard Dolan, an expert on the UFO subject, is convinced that the late monarch was aware of the conversations between Philip and his uncle. He said, "You have to assume Queen Elizabeth knew."
Oh, of course. I'm sure as the monarch of the UK, she was privy to all that stuff.
I'm sure that there's not a whole lot that happened that she didn't know about. Now, whether or not she was going to discuss it, that's a whole different story.
Exactly. And being Americans, I don't know much about how the royal family fits into the whole government thing, or if they're just figureheads. I've heard it talked about in many different ways, but you have to remember, we were the rebels. We broke away from that and wanted nothing to do with it. And the only thing I really remember that caused a stir with the royal family was Princess Di.
Yeah, which we already know that situation. Don't want to, I hate to say it, dig that one up.
Well, but again, it's like this weird paparazzi tabloid family kind of stuff when it comes to the royal family. So I don't know much about it. I'm sure our UK listeners will, just like over here, probably some fall on the side of yay the royals, and then some on the other like no, those people were useless and they stole money and everything else. So I don't know, that's their country. They can figure it out.
No, they're as much on TV over here as the Kardashians are.
Well, I don't watch much TV, so...
I'm just talking about in the news. I mean, I've grown up my whole entire life with the royals being on, the news here, the news there, who's moved out of the country, who's now living in Canada.
I guess I don't watch enough TV to really pick up on that.
Oh, my parents, I can still remember sitting in the living room watching the wedding of Princess Diana.
Well, that was a big deal because wasn't she American? Wasn't that the big thing?
That was like an event in my household, and then it was the watching of everything after that and her life. And then, unfortunately, her death.
Yeah, and she did a lot for charity. I mean...
Yes. She was very rooted in charities. So that's what I'm talking about as far as a comparison. I mean, It's just different, shifts in, the values that were presented to, a viewing audience.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. Like I said, the only thing I recall is the marriage of Princess Di, and then when she unfortunately died, that's all I really remember of any of that stuff. And being a red-blooded American, we were the rebels. The Revolutionary War, we were getting away from England, so I never really followed any of that.
And being famous, even if it's part of a royal family, that puts a target on you to be the center of attention in the media. So maybe that was a fear as to why none of that came out or any of the investigations.
Oh, I'm sure. Especially back then, they probably would have been made fun of. They already got ridiculed quite a bit. The tabloids loved them.
I know. Now I'm intrigued to look into that 1979 assassination.
Yeah, that's really strange.
Of the uncle. That's... Wow.
Yep. All right, Michelle. I think we should bring on our next guest, and man, is this one amazing. Absolutely amazing. And so on this episode of the podcast, we're going to have Matt Lohmeier come on. Kind of a controversial dude, depending on what side of the aisle you're in, but he is much more than what people who are partisan may think about him. So, I don't know, Michelle? You want to tell us a little bit about Matt?
Well, Matt Lohmeier is a public speaker, author of the best-selling book, Irresistible Revolution, Marxism's Goal of Conquest and the Unmaking of the American Military, and founder of the Save America's Military PAC, the SAM PAC. He actively works with the veteran-led nonprofit group STARS to educate Americans about the dangers of racist and radical ideologies that are infiltrating our military. He is also host of the Matt Lohmeier Show. His book, Irresistible Revolution, was published in May of 2021, at which time Matt was a respected active duty commander in the newly formed U.S. Space Force. For publishing and speaking about his book, then Lieutenant Colonel Lohmeier was relieved of his command and subjected to an Inspector General investigation launched from the Pentagon. He subsequently joined the nation's biggest media personalities to discuss proliferation of Marxist-rooted critical race theory, CRT, in the military and its divisive impact on the force and mission. Matt separated from active duty on September 1st of 2021 and is now a highly sought public speaker and consultant on matters of Marxist ideology and tactics, CRT, the betterment of military culture, and the preservation of our liberties. A 2006 graduate of the United States Air Force Academy, Matt began his active duty military career as a pilot, flying over 1,200 hours in the T-38 as an instructor pilot, followed by flying the F-15C. After flying, he cross-trained into space operations and gained expertise in space-based missile warning. Matt promoted 2 years below the zone to lieutenant colonel, graduated at the top of his classes, earning him the Distinguished Graduate Award at 4 different Air Force schools, and served as aide-de-camp for a 4-star general for 1 year. In October of 2020, he transferred into the United States Space Force and was placed in command of a space-based missile warning squadron in Colorado. Matt has 2 master's degrees, a master's in military operational art and science, and a master of philosophy in military strategy from the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies, considered by many the Defense Department's premier strategy school. He lives with his wife and children in Idaho.
Yeah, that's quite a background, and I think it's time for us to just go ahead and bring on Matt Lohmeier.
Yeah, time to get Matt on the show.
All right, Matt, thanks for joining us tonight. It's great to have you on board.
Yep, happy to be here.
Well, I know you're taking a lot of time out of your busy day, and we want to try to just be as direct as we can with some of these questions and get you on and then let you go ahead and enjoy the night with your family.
All right.
All right. So let's go ahead and start out with, can you tell our audience a little bit of your background and what made you decide to join the Air Force and eventually become a leader in the Space Force?
Sure. I have a problem with saying too much sometimes, and so let me try and hit some of the highlights. I didn't really have an ambition to join the military in high school, but was good at basketball, better at basketball than I was academically, I suppose, at that point. And so I was recruited to play basketball by various colleges and ended up taking a recruiting visit to the Air Force Academy. And while there, they really put on a good show for you. At least they did back in the day, and made me think it was really the most exciting place I could be. And so I decided to go there. It was while I was at the Air Force Academy that I decided I didn't actually want to go pre-med. I thought I'd instead fly jets because I got an incentive flight in a T-38 at Edwards Air Force Base out in California, where they do test pilot missions on various platforms. And so I got this exciting ride in a T-38 and decided that's the path I'd pursue, and I did. I graduated from the Air Force Academy and went to pilot training at Vance Air Force Base in Oklahoma. I don't know if the statistic is still the same, but at the time I graduated from the Air Force Academy, about 50% of the graduates went on to pilot training somewhere. So you had probably your best shot out of any path to being an officer in our Air Force. Best shot at flying an aircraft was coming out as a graduate of the Air Force Academy. But I went to Vance, flew the T-38, requested to fly the A-10. That was my number one choice. Ended up sticking around for another 3 years as a T-38 instructor pilot. So I got about 1,000 hours in the T-38 over the next several years and got to fly all over the country with students, and students from many countries, in fact. And then came time again to select which aircraft I wanted to fly, and I selected A-10s again. and ended up flying the F-15. And I flew
Two
the
distinctly different types of aircraft right there.
Yeah, and I didn't fly the Strike Eagle, which would be an air-to-ground variant, which would have been more similar to the type of mission flown by an A-10. I mean, I say that somewhat loosely, but I flew the C model, which is a single-seat air-to-air superiority fighter, which I wouldn't trade for anything in the world. But I did that for just a year out in Japan. I was stationed at Kadena Air Base. Ended up being medically separated from the flying community. And I'll just add in here, by this time, while I hadn't seen anything exciting in my life while I was active duty military from a UAP or UFO standpoint, I had already in my life, previous to joining the military, had one experience. I imagine we might get into that later on.
Absolutely. So, we're gonna ask you that toward the end. So
okay. So I end up having this option before me about what career field I wanted to pursue after leaving the flying community. And my next door neighbor happened to be the only space officer on the base at Kadena. And I went and asked him how he liked Air Force Space Command, which was the MAJCOM or Major Command that was responsible for all things national security space. Happens to belong to at the time, to the the Department of the Air Force. And he just complained up and down, left and right about everything that was being a space officer. I was stuck in Colorado for 6 years. I hated it. I've been begging to deploy, couldn't get deployed. And, my wife's from Colorado. I liked the idea of being stuck in Colorado for a military assignment. And so we decided to go into the space route. So that was 2013 when this happened, and went into Air Force Space Community. I was assigned to work in space-based missile warning operations. And our nation's 2 space-based missile warning units are at Buckley Air Force Base in Colorado. We use infrared sensors in geosynchronous orbit. You're talking, we're about 23,000 miles out. Good analogy I like to give people. If you have your standard size globe that, fits in your hand, you put a yardstick on that globe and put a little fleck of dust out in that, at the end of that yardstick. That's about where our infrared sensors sit out in geosynchronous orbit. You can see about a third of the surface of the Earth from out there. And of course, you're seeing the infrared part of the EMF spectrum. Now, I did that job for a few years, went and got a couple of master's degrees on the Air Force's dollar. One was in military strategy at the DoD's Premier Strategy School, and then came out of that school in 2020 and was a lieutenant colonel and went to command one of those space-based missile warning units at Buckley. So that was kind of my path to your question, Michelle, leadership in the Space Force, a greatly abbreviated version of events. But that was 2020 to 2021. I ended up separating from active duty in 2021 after authoring a book that got me in a little bit of trouble. It wasn't about UFOs, unfortunately.
You'd probably be in more trouble if it was about UFOs.
Yeah, if I knew anything useful about it, I'd probably be in prison. But
yeah.
So that was kind of the end of my military career. Was the fall of 2021, and I've been a civilian for a year now, and joining talk shows like this, podcasts, and speaking around the country about the things I wrote about in my book. So yeah, that's kind of that's the overarching history of my Air Force and Space Force career.
Awesome. So there seems to be some kind of confusion about the mission of Space Force out there, or at least out here in the civilian world. And it kind of gets made a joke of, there was the Netflix movie about it, and they got the guy from The Office to play the dippy commander and all of that. And I think it does have something to do with the political climate and who signed off on creating Space Force and everything else. Because, well, everything is a political football in this world anymore. But can you give us a good breakdown of the history of the Space Force and what is its mission truly today?
Yeah. It's funny. I meet people all the time, even today, who, when they hear there's a Space Force, were shocked, or I ask them if they're aware that there was a new branch of the military that's space related. They look at me like they're a deer caught in the headlights. So that's just a function of people not really paying attention to what's going on around them in the world, and they pay attention to whatever their social media feed happens to be telling them any day of the week. Now don't take offense, but I'm going to correct one thing you said for clarity. The guy who happened to sign off on the Space Force doesn't exist, and I'll clarify what I mean by that. A president, in this case, it was President Trump and the Trump administration, does not have legal authority or the power, even as the chief executive, to create an independent branch of the military. Now, I'll tell you, Trump had a certain oomph to his determination to ensure the creation of an independent branch of the military for space. And he had, as a vice president, a space nerd and space junkie in Mike Pence, who loved and was a champion of scientific exploration in space, a champion of NASA, and so forth. They stood up a National Space Council in Washington, D.C. that is doing important work. And so Trump kind of surprised when he made this announcement. He surprised the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who was General Joe Dunford at the time, the secretary of the Air Force, the civilian leader of the Air Force, who was Heather Wilson. And he said, "Hey, I heard Space Force." And I thought, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's do it. Now, the unfortunate, so he surprised them, and there was some pushback, to be sure, but this was not a conversation that was new during the Trump administration. In fact, there are two congressmen that deserve credit. It was a bipartisan effort even before the Trump administration. There was a Democrat congressman in Tennessee named Jim Cooper, and a Republican congressman in Alabama named Mike Rogers, who were friends working together for the creation of a Space Corps before the Trump administration came in. And I'll tell you, when Trump announced a direction to stand up an independent branch of the military for space, they were beside themselves, upset at the possibility that he lost the opportunity forever, because now it was going to your point, be such a partisan issue that it would never pass a vote in the Congress. And in fact, it did. It required a majority vote, bipartisan vote in the Congress to create an independent branch of the military. And so in December of 2019, that vote passed, and it was written into law, into U.S. Code Title 10, that this would be the newest branch of the military. First time since 1947 that we've created a new branch of the military. That took place just after World War II with the creation of the U.S. Air Force. And so, to really succinctly share the history of a Space Force, I will hark back to the creation of the Air Force to say, just like from World War I onward into World War II, a couple of decades later, you had a U.S. Army that was exploring and experimenting with flying aircraft and how to drop bricks out of aircraft, and then how to shoot handguns out of aircraft, and then how to further weaponize those aircraft to attack the ground or other aircraft in the skies. And by World War II, we had developed our Army Air Corps significantly, and other countries had beat us to it. I mean, Great Britain had created an independent branch of the Air Force. I think it was probably, I don't know if it was the late 1920s or even earlier. Germany had a powerful Air Force. Italy had, and Japan were developing their air forces. And so the U.S. decides finally in 1947, after the close of the war, that we would create a separate branch of the military because it was so critical to the future development of our national security. We thought that we're going to have a branch of the military that is independently responsible for that domain. And we will also give it its own budget, its budgetary prerogative. And we did the same thing with space. We had an Air Force steward and shepherd space capabilities throughout the Cold War during the space race. But the Air Force, it was deemed, wasn't necessarily the best steward for a budget of space and a culture of space and the domain of space, because it has competition inherent to that organization, namely F-22s, F-35s, and everything else. So every time you needed to pilfer funds from somewhere to feed the F-35, that really sleek space capability we're working on, we're going to kick that can down the road 5 years because we really need $100 million. That was kind of one of the driving motivators for a new branch of the military for space. So, and it wasn't Trump's Space Force, although he should get some credit for it because he had the drive. It was a bipartisan vote, and it is U.S. law, and so there was concern when the new administration took control. It was like, oh, geez, is the Space Force going to go away? That was Trump's thing. And that's the wrong way to look at it. It wasn't a partisan issue, and no partisan effort can undo what's been done by bipartisan vote in the Congress.
Okay, that's good. And that's some great history out there.
And I think it's good for the listeners to hear that too, because that way, because everything that's put out on, the media and on not only social media, but the news is always very clouded. So it's nice to get,
it's hard.
Yeah.
It's nice to get a clearer perspective on it.
Yeah. Cause people bring their biases into any kind of conversation, especially with politics and everything. And, it's just unfortunate because people on both sides of the aisle can have good ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And, you just have to be able to filter that stuff out. And, I think that's where the human element, we run into problems in Washington, D.C. and our elected leaders that, okay, I'll pass this bill if you give me a little bit of this kind of thing. And then, you get this weird thing going on instead of just thinking about what's good for the defense of the country, what's good for the defense of the people. And, kind of just keeping it simple like that. But as humans, we love to make things very complicated. So with that being said, so what then truly is the mission of Space Force? Is it everything outside the atmosphere at this point?
Okay, yeah, I didn't answer that part of the question. I guess that was a part of the question.
It was, but you gave us a great history lesson, and
yeah,
that was awesome.
Okay, so there was this funny, I wish I knew the title of the video, and I don't even know. I can't remember the guy's name who does the. He has his own show, Trevor Noah. Someone just sent me a link, and there was an Asian reporter who somehow got granted, and he plays up his Asianness, and that's why I mentioned it. It was a part of the clip, and he says, I'm not even a citizen, and I've somehow been granted access to go in to the Pentagon to interview the chief of space operations today. This video is just, I think, a week or two old, if I'm not mistaken. He says, I'm going to go and figure out what Space Force really does, because none of us really know. And he sits down, it's great footage, with General Jay Raymond, the 4-star former Air Force general, now in charge of Space Force. And he says, hey, what do you guys really do? And he gets some muddy answers from General Raymond. And he's like, yeah, I still don't know what you do. And it sounds really boring what you're doing. And General Raymond's got this really serious look on his face. It's a clever video. I wish, maybe I could send you the link afterward, but it's a 5-minute hilarious. It's meant to be comedic. And he kind of summarizes his visit in the Pentagon with General Raymond. And the end is, he says, hey, that was really exciting. I still don't know what the hell these guys do, but glad I was able to sit down with General Raymond. And that's kind of the perception that people have when they hear Space Force and they want to know what's happening. It's kind of tough for them to feel like they're able to put their finger on the pulse. So let me give it to you straight.
Okay.
You might feel like my answer's no more exciting than the answers General Raymond gave to this reporter. Okay, so at this point, it's helpful to further disambiguate two organizations. There is a U.S. Space Command, and there is a U.S. Space Force, and they're very different. One of them is the new branch of the military that we've been talking about. That's U.S. Space Force, a 4-star general, Air Force general, now Space Force general, is the commander of that new branch of the military. The purpose of all of the branches of the military, this is maybe more information and education than you even cared for, but it's good to know. Every branch of the military, whether it's Army or Air Force or Space Force, and so on and so forth, has as their primary legally defined obligation training and equipping their services forces, persons, people, to do a certain mission in defense of the nation. But it is not those services that wage conflict. Okay, they just organize, train, and equip the forces. What that amounts to is, for example, the GPS on your phone, and that we provide as a free service to people all over the globe, is provided by young men and women sitting in a dark room without windows in Colorado Springs. And that was previously under the stewardship or prerogative of the service that we know as the Air Force. But when we stood up the branch of the military that we call Space Force, that mission, those people, those capabilities all transferred into a new branch of the military. They're not waging war with those capabilities per se. We simply train personnel to do a mission with those capabilities. That's the job of the Space Force. There's a missile warning mission, both from the ground-based radars, and from space-based missile warning. We organize and we train and we equip people to do that mission. Okay, I'm making this distinction. I'm pedantic, I understand. There is an entirely separate organization that I mentioned, U.S. Space Command, that has the legal purview of waging conflict. And so U.S. Space Command is not led by the same four-star general officer that is in charge of the Space Force. He organizes, trains, and equips people. And then in a time of conflict, or if something is deemed a conflict scenario, we, for lack of or to simplify things, we send our well-trained persons and capabilities to a combatant commander whose responsibility is waging war. We have them in charge of geographic regions in the planet, like one of them is the Indo-Pacific, or we call it Indo-PACOM, the Indo-Pacific region. We've got one in CENTCOM, or the Central Command, which is like the Middle Eastern countries. We've got one in Europe, EUCOM. All of these combatant commanders have the responsibility of waging war if it comes to war. But the military branches themselves don't do the waging of war. That was a construct that was changed a few decades back. And so what Space Force does at the highest level you can imagine is organize, train, and equip forces for use in war, should we ever need to fight a war. And then it's these combatant commanders that wage the war. Now, since no one really cares about what I've just said in the last 2 minutes, I'll tell you what they really care about. All right. So the things that your Space Force people are doing publicly on a day in and day out basis are things that you thought, if you knew anything about it, your Air Force was already doing, like doing GPS mission, providing that blue dot on Google Maps and giving the GPS signal to users everywhere all over the planet, from airline pilots to tank drivers to farmers in their fields. It's a free service that's provided. Of course, primarily we're doing it for national security purposes. We are doing ground and space-based missile warning mission, as I mentioned. We're providing strategic communications from certain architecture of satellites that are up there as well. And there's of course intelligence gathering, there's targeting, weapons targeting missions, and all of those things we've been doing for a very long time from space, that the Air Force used to be responsible for. All of that kind of naturally transitioned into the Space Force, and all of the people that were doing those missions transferred into the Space Force and now just wear a very similar uniform, slightly different rank structure, slightly different, titles. And so what the Space Force is willing to publicly acknowledge that it's doing is not going to be a surprise probably to most Americans or adversaries. Now, China and Russia might know even a little bit better, and they set up their own independent cyber and space forces earlier than we did back in 2015. They would know even better as a government or as governments what our Space Force is doing than even the American people might. And the United States Space Force leadership and our Defense Department leaders know very well what Russia and China are doing in space, far better than is generally known. And of course, what we will do is we will point to what Russia or China are doing in space. This has been said publicly, so I can now say it. I couldn't have said it a couple of years ago. For example, Russia has a type of satellite that it's put up that is kind of like a nesting doll. You've got a satellite that opens up, and there's another satellite inside, and it opens up. There's another one inside, and so you can launch one thing on one platform, and it can turn into many things that have various functionality. Some of them, as you could imagine, might be used as weapons. And so that's a concern that our senior leaders point to as justification or rationale for some of the capabilities we then put up in space. China has an arm on one of its satellites that can potentially reach out and grab or shake or interfere with other space capabilities. So while that doesn't sound very futuristic or sci-fi-y, not everything is as benign as we've hoped it was up there. And for a long, long time, there have been efforts to develop things that could be used as weapons in space. And of course, each host nation that develops those capabilities will assert, of course, up and down, that they're just simply trying to defend their own architecture. I'm the good guy. I'm simply defending against the terrible aggressor that lives across the world. And so then politics is a part of the discussion.
Right.
So those are the kinds of things that our senior military leaders right now are acknowledging that they're working on, problems they're working on solving. And they don't go much further than that. Now, you can use your imagination. People have watched sci-fi and can start guessing at the kinds of things that in reality people have been thinking about for decades, about things we might be able to do in space. I mean, heavens, 4 decades ago, Reagan comes into office and announces a Star Wars program that then is shortly thereafter abandoned because of a number of reasons, but one of which was, well, we just don't have the technological know-how yet to do this. Well, maybe. Right. And so that's kind of abandoned, at least publicly it is.
And then he also was famously known for his, what if there was an alien attack? How fast would our differences change as well? So kind of odd. And a lot of people have, gone to certain leaps of, speculation of, okay, so he's talking about a space-based weapon platform and the possibility of maybe aliens might attack. So, and I'm not going to lie, when I first heard about Space Force, and I'm an older dude, I think I'm older than you. I remember as a kid watching 007 Moonraker. And in that movie, they fought in outer space, like guys coming out of the space shuttle. Like the space shuttle was a troop carrier. And the space shuttle would open up and these guys in jetpacks and stuff would come out and they would fight this war back and forth. So when I was thinking that, I actually had people telling me, see, they're finally admitting it. We've been fighting on Mars. We've been doing all this. Now they're finally admitting that there's a space force. And that imagery jumped right in my head back from like 1980 something when Moonraker came out. And, so it's just, go ahead.
Let me say something about that. So not about the space shuttle. I'm not going to talk about that. But as you're aware, space shuttle wasn't an Air Force program per se. I mean, NASA is created at a critical time in American history. It's been over a half century. And let me think through. Don't edit out any of this, by the way. It's good that your viewer or your listeners see me struggling to answer this question, and it's not because I don't know something about it. It's if people have studied Cold War history, for example, even a bit, they'll see that some of the timing of the creation of certain federal agencies, NASA is one of them. So we'll just stay with that for now, and the establishment of the Air Force and the capabilities that we were working on. The timing oftentimes, I'll say, isn't coincidental, and there's a corroboration between the national security or national defense side of the equation on the one hand, and say the civil or private later sector on the other hand, and so I'll exaggerate this next point to say that almost there, now it's not an exaggeration, what people might do with their imagination and trying to tease out what we've been up to. I mean, you're probably not that far off, to be honest. Now, you might be. You might be wildly off if you've got a great imagination. But I mean, the fact is, as far as the human imagination can extend, and it was just as active a half century ago at the beginning of the space race as it is today. And if you read a little bit of the Cold War history and some history about the space age, you'll see that we had fantastic minds thinking about how we might exploit that domain ever since the get-go. And then you have questions about, like Lou Elizondo and others assert, that the U.S. is in possession of exotic materials. Well, if things like that are in fact the case, then who has it? What have they done with it? And what have they been working on? What programs have been established, and who knew about them and when? Who lied about it and when? And for what purpose have we been trying to replicate or reproduce technology? I'm not necessarily asserting I believe the same as Lou Elizondo, but there are plenty of experts out there that think they know something about what we've been up to, and it's all very fascinating. And so, yeah, about time we had a Space Force, right? I mean, it's been a long time coming.
Well, I think of it from a planetary defense idea, not so much aliens and things like that. But getting into my next question, then, are you monitoring, or is Space Force monitoring for other things besides just like you were a missile defense commander at a base? You know, are you guys looking for like large meteorites or possible asteroids that might impact and get into the cataclysmic type of, or catastrophism type of idea?
Okay, I'm going to answer that question right after. I'm going to say two more things. First, I don't, just because I don't know if we'll come back to this. You know, the moon, you mentioned Mars, the moon. I want to say China has been active on the moon for a little while. And I don't mean with people that they dropped off on a space shuttle, but they've been planting things in orbit at Earth Moon Lagrange points, relay satellite at EML2, so that they can see the far side of the moon, what they're doing on the far side of the moon. But, you know, the U.S. has lacked the capability to see some of what they've been doing. And so in some ways we've fallen behind the power curve, and which is one of the, in a classified setting, I suppose, in testimony to the Congress, that kind of provided some impetus for some of them to get on board and have bipartisan support. It's like, wow, to say nothing of what exists out there, either from an extraterrestrial intelligent perspective or otherwise from a rock perspective, near-Earth asteroids and objects and so forth. There was very real geopolitical concerns that extended out into cislunar space and even on the far side of the moon down near the south lunar pole that China was doing, that that people began to take very seriously. I just wanted to get that in there.
Hey everyone, we hope you're enjoying the podcast. We're going to take a quick break to hear a word from our sponsors and some friends of the podcast.
Hello, my name is Burton, and I am the host of Follow the Reaper podcast, where every episode we examine first and secondhand true paranormal encounters. And you're listening to Wayne and Michelle on the Michigan UFO Sightings and Paranormal Encounters podcast.
Hi, everyone. This is Jared Murphy of NotAliens.com, and you are listening to Wayne and Michelle from Michigan UFO Sightings and Paranormal Encounters podcast.
Hey there, it's Richard Serrett, occasional weekend guest host of Coast to Coast AM and host of The Conspiracy Show, and you're listening to Wayne and Michelle's Michigan UFO Sightings and Paranormal Encounters podcast.
What's up, everyone? This is Burton.
And Aaron from Lost in the Dark podcast.
And raise your horns because you're listening to Wayne and Michelle from the Michigan UFO Sightings and Paranormal Encounters podcast.
What is up, you guys? It's your girl Gemma Jade from Gemma Jade YouTube, Moon Bear Oracle, Paranormal Chop Shop. You're here listening to Wayne and Michelle with the Michigan UFO Sightings and Paranormal Encounters podcast.
Hi, this is Chris Lato of the Chris Lato YouTube channel, retired F-16 pilot turned UAP investigator, and you are listening to Wayne and Michelle on the Michigan UFO Sightings and Paranormal Encounters podcast.
Hi, this is Terry Lynn Keel, Director of MUFON Memberships, investigator, demonologist, and author of Alien Healing, the true story of a benevolent extraterrestrial. And you're listening to Wayne and Michelle on the Michigan UFO Sightings and Paranormal Encounters podcast.
Hello, everyone. This is Michael Schratt, military aerospace historian and private pilot, and you are listening to Wayne and Michelle at the Michigan UFO Sightings and Paranormal Encounters podcast, and we're glad to have you with us today.
Hi, this is Sev Talk from MUFON, and the author of You Have the Right to Talk to Aliens, and the host of Alien Spirit TV with Sev on YouTube. You're listening to Wayne and Michelle at the Michigan UFO Sightings and Paranormal Encounters podcast.
What's happening, ladies and gentlemen? This is Big Willie with the UFO Garage podcast, where we're all about UFOs, aliens, and all things weird. I also run a podcast, Band of Bearded Brothers, with my brother Micah, B-O-B-B for short, and you are listening to Wayne and Michelle with the Michigan UFO Sightings and Paranormal Encounters podcast. So take a seat and buckle up as they educate us on all things woo.
Hi, this is Alexei Novitsky, and you're listening to Wayne and Michelle on the Michigan UFO Sightings and Paranormal Encounters podcast. What I'd like to show you guys is the infinite pool of experience and awareness, which can be found at luciuslabs.com. And it's a book that I've written after basically meditating for 27 years. Basically goes over modern physics and takes you all the way from modern accepted physics to understanding that we live in a layering of conscious types within time and that our consciousness is eternal.
Now, as far as what we look at, people should appreciate that just as in the land domain, we've got every type of sensor available. You've got an optical sensor. It's like it works like your eyes, the camera that we're using now. You've got infrared sensor that might be able to detect a heat signature. You've got other sensors that might be an audio only kind of a frequency. For example, you've got X-ray part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And so you've got sensors basically that fall any number of places on the electromagnetic spectrum. And so as you can imagine, you can both amplify your optical sensor like a binocular or a telescope or Hubble and look into deep space using something like a Hubble or a James Webb telescope. Think if you had something that was powerful, even optically, that you could turn around and point towards the Earth. I mean, we put things like that on SR-71s, U-2 spy planes, that even as early on in the Cold War, during the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 60s, we're looking down from very high altitudes with very powerful cameras, and we're seeing what's happening on the ground. And we've got far better capabilities up in space today. And so think we've got a number of different types of sensors. We've got ways to potentially, and this is all public, I'm not saying anything that's we've got different ways to fuse, I'll say it that way, different types of sensors together to create pictures.
Yeah.
I'll say you've got a false sense of privacy in the 21st century. Even if you think you're behind walls that have no windows, people can make a picture and find where you're sitting, right? And so imagine that we've got those things, and now we've got different layers of architecture in our space Enterprise from low Earth orbit, starting roughly 100 kilometers up on out to medium Earth orbit, out to geo, which we talked about earlier, geosynchronous orbits out at, past 22 and 23,000 miles. And they've got highly elliptical orbits that go over the poles. And you're able to somehow synthesize potentially a picture of what you can see from 22,000 miles out and in. And that's only if the sensors are pointed towards the Earth. Okay. I want to make that point. So if all you've got is sensors pointed towards the Earth, you'll at least be able to see what is potentially threatening to the Earth environment from about 20 and 30,000 miles out and on down. But that doesn't really help you if you got fast moving objects like near Earth asteroids. And I mean, the moon's 240,000 miles out nominally. And so you ideally want to be able to see at least that far out. And so if it's possible, I'm being careful how I choose my language, but if it was possible to turn an asset around and point outward, then in theory, you could see what exists outside of those orbits, and in some cases with great fidelity. But the harder problem is, how do you, even if you detect something that is an imminent threat and it's on a collision course with the Earth, how is it that you then deflect or break up or stop that from impacting the Earth? And that's a harder problem for nations to solve internationally, because if you devise a platform to do that kind of damage, well, geez, that's a threatening weapon.
Yeah, then
and
you
we
can
don't
turn
trust
it around,
you,
right? And then you can turn it around toward the Earth at that point,
right? Yeah, and do you do it from Earth? Do you do it from somewhere in space? Do you launch things from the moon? And so all of that's been explored, being explored, and the question is, can you be public with it? And are nations willing to work together on those kinds of capabilities? The answer is no.
Yeah.
And so then you have a really big problem, and it's who can develop them the fastest, and where do they place them, and how secret can they keep them for how long, right?
Yeah.
That's a difficult challenge. Ideally, everyone loved each other in this world, and political territorial integrity and political sovereignty didn't matter as much as it did to these countries. And they said, hey, let's try and keep our planet safe, and let's devise something that's phenomenal together. We'll pool our resources, and we'll protect this little bubble that we live in, right?
Well, I don't know. Are you familiar with Chris Lato? He was a F-16 fighter pilot turned UAP investigator now, and he's set up the UAP Society. No?
That name is familiar, but I don't know who that is.
Okay. Well, we had him on the show and we were talking to him for a little bit. And, what you explained with the different layering of the sensors, it was kind of what we were talking about. And this kind of leads into my next question when it comes to looking at the Navy videos of the Tic Tac and the Go Fast and the gimbal. And we were talking about listening to the pilots, and they were talking about their SA page, their situational awareness. And we were talking about how you have different, E2 Hawkeyes and different radars from different ships providing different angles to give a pilot, one person, this overall 360-degree situational awareness, which, sounds exactly like that. But now we need to extrapolate that out into space so we can look at that different layers. So that makes sense. If I got any of that wrong, let me know. Am I close?
Okay. One of the hardest challenges that are I don't know if I should put it that way. Let me say a big challenge that our space community faces is the development of space. Well, it's space situational awareness, I'll call it. There's an air domain situational awareness, and a space domain awareness is one of the challenges they face. And how is it that you build the appropriate picture? And then, I was just asked, I shouldn't even say this on the air, but I was just asked last week if I would consider going and teaching at a certain school that the Space Force has, teaching space battle management. And space domain awareness, and I'm not going to do that. But these are big challenges that our new Space Force operators are trying to work on. Senior leaders are concerned about figuring out. And so, I think the American people, of course, assume rightly, and should assume that there's things the Space Force is doing that they're not going to hear about. And some of those things, we've even been public to say, hey, there's a new unit, or there are several new units that have been stood up. Their mission's really classified, and so you're not going to learn about it, but trust us, they're doing good things for the nation. They're trying to work on combating the threats that are beginning to emerge in space. Well, again, I mean, you could guess 100 different directions what they're really doing, and you'll probably be somewhat right and somewhat wrong. But maybe it'll be 5 or 10 years before the American people really get to hear what some of those units are actually working on. But there's a lot in development, and then there's other agencies that feed capabilities to our new Space Force. I mean, DARPA is working on things, and there's other 3-letter agencies that are very well integrated with our new branch of the military, because they too have eyeballs up there in that domain that are building a picture. And there's no way Space Force can do its mission right unless they collaborate with just about every other intelligence community entity that exists out there that has some capability up there.
Okay. Well, going back to talking about the Go Fast gimbal and Tic Tac that got everybody excited back in 2017, when these things were either leaked or released, depending on what side of the aisle you want to fall on. It's a psyop or it's actually real. You know, it's individually based anymore. But Kevin Day, who was one of the chief radar operators, claimed that they would see these things dropping down from 80,000 feet in a matter of a couple seconds, then stop a few feet, maybe 50 feet or so above the ocean, and then either like move off, or they would submerge and then pop back up again. Very strange objects. Do you know of any strange or similar objects that may have been detected by Space Force monitoring equipment that may confirm what the Navy and Kevin Day was reporting?
I don't personally, but one thing I can say about it is that my suspicion is that if the Navy or the Air Force is able to use any of their sensors to see this kind of phenomenon, then again, my suspicion is that our new branch of the military, the Space Force, is likely also able to see, and then in the appropriate classified settings, corroborate what it is that these other services are seeing with their sensors. Now, not all sensors are created equal, and so that's really all I know about it. And that's not the right way of saying it. Let me say it this way: that's my suspicion about whether or not our space community is seeing that kind of thing, or our intelligence community. And I can't even really talk to any of that.
Okay. Yeah, I would assume that Space Force would know something about that going on. But again, you know what they say about assumptions.
That's right.
But based on what we were just talking about, back in June of 2021, and I believe you were still in Space Force at the time.
I was.
There was the ODNI UAP report of the 25th of June. And were you guys briefed at all about this coming out, or what they were putting together? I mean, here in the public, we got 9 pages. If you take away the cover sheets and things, we got 6 pages. And, everybody, well, depending on, again, what side you're on. Oh, you got disclosure. This is disclosure, yada, yada. UFOs are real. They don't necessarily say that, but were you guys briefed on that? And what's your thoughts on that?
So yeah, my recollection is that ODNI unclassified report indicated that there were over 140 independent reports, or 140,
like 143, and then 100, and then one of them or something like that was figured out to be, a weather balloon or something like that. But there was quite a bit, like 141 that they could not explain.
And that I want to say over a dozen of them, or maybe 20 of them, up to 20 of them, had exhibited some unusual, abnormal flight characteristics.
Yeah.
So the answer to your question is no, I was not briefed on it. And just to paint a picture in your mind, think of a pyramid. And sitting atop the pyramid are a few people with access to all of the information that's available to the space community. And I'm saying like a very few people. Okay. And then everything below that top part of the pyramid, I mean, it's known in ancient Egypt as the Ben stone. Think there's a Ben stone atop the pyramid, and there's a few people sitting up there. They have access to it. And everyone else beneath the Ben stone in that pyramid structure, which was me and everyone else, including all the 1 and 2 stars and the 3 stars, were simply reading about it as news reports came out about the unclassified report, and we're learning about it and maybe paying attention to it and maybe not, just like you were or the American people were. Now, greater percentage of our Space Force, of course, would have taken interest in that report than, say, the typical American. But there were no special briefings. If it wasn't pertinent to your missile warning mission or your GPS mission or whatever you did, you just weren't. There's too much stuff going on a day-to-day basis, and whatever your specialty is, to have briefings on that. And we were too busy talking about systemic racism and other things. So no time to discuss UFOs.
which is a really bizarre thing to occupy the military with, but that's going off on a different political tangent that, when people, if people are interested in reading your book and seeing some of your videos on it, more power to you. But we're going to try to keep this focused to,
that was just reality.
Yeah.
That's just reality. I mean, whether someone's, whatever their political views.
Yes.
Military's distracted with bad priorities a lot of the time in the last couple of years.
Yeah, it really does seem to be that way. Racial group politics and all that stuff. And, it's infiltrating the military, but like I said, we won't get into that too much.
What would be great is if instead of any number of diversions that senior military leaders are titillated by and are interested in spending their time with, they said, you know what's critical? Let's take this OD&I report, even the unclassified version. We're going to mandate that's reading by this Friday. We want every Space Force member to read that report. So now you've read it. Maybe you have a half an hour chat about it. Go get some pizza together if you got some free time, and let's talk about it. And you should be thinking about this stuff. I mean, but guess what? I bet you 90% of Space Force personnel, and I'm not exaggerating, have never heard of that report.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
10% of them naturally have an interest in it, and so they go look into it.
Right. All right. Well, a little bit more of kind of a cynical question for you.
Okay.
It seems that the Navy, if there hasn't been enough already, but it seems like the Navy's the one that's been tapped on the shoulder to deal with this UFO UAP phenomenon, and the Air Force, which used to run programs like Project Blue Book, Project Sign, Project Grudge, they don't have the best track record when it comes to these things, when it is, something to do with UFOs, UAPs. And they seem very silent and almost non-existent in this new interest in this phenomenon. So would you care to speculate, or do you maybe know a little bit of the background information as to why the Air Force seems to be not allowed to sit at the cool kids table when it comes to this?
Well, I'll that's tempting bait, but I'm going to answer it a little bit differently.
It wasn't meant to be, but speculation is good, and I do want to get your views on UFOs and UAPs.
Yeah, there's a UAP task force, and there have been any number of, as you mentioned, projects established for the purpose of investigating these phenomena, and in some cases they've been well funded, in other cases maybe less so. But see, my sense of how things typically work in our military, for better and for worse, is that whatever your flavor ice cream is that you happen to be licking in your neck of the woods, you just, like, I'm not kidding. I get that the pyramid is such a useful analogy. It's like everyone's working on that piece except for a few people who have been plucked off out of their community to work on those task forces or those groups. And then when they're given access, and this is the key part, to work on some of those things, they're not going to talk about it with anyone.
So it's like the ultimate in compartmentalization.
Well, think about it. I mean, if there's something here worth exploring. If there's something actually either critical to our national security because there are adversaries who are developing these wicked good capabilities, let's say, or they have an extraterrestrial origin and someone happens to know that too, and there's a past there that, I mean, think Area 51. I mean, who knows what's going on there? No one, unless they've worked there. And even if they work there, they only know their slice of the pie. That's it. They don't know what they don't know what the right hand's doing if they're the left hand, and vice versa. So that's how, to your point, that's how super compartmentalization works. It's like, if you're to protect some overarching picture, no one's got all the pieces to put together, and that's why everyone starts talking past each other, even if they do have access to information. I mean, when Truman comes into office in World War II, he didn't even know there was a Manhattan Project that we'd been working on to develop the nuclear weapon, and he's read into it after the fact. And I mean, like, I think I've got that right. I'm pretty sure I've got the right guy. He's the one that ends up using the weapon.
Yeah.
But the point is, like, there are things going on every day of the week that certain people know about that no one in this country or world will ever hear about. And many of those people will take those things to the grave. And someone else is working on some critical component that's going to be fitted together with that other piece. And they don't know that they're working on something that's going to fit together with the other piece. This is so if there's something truly phenomenal and critical going on there, people work on various pieces and usually don't know the whole picture. But there are some people, and there are some few, that do know a bigger picture. They're hard to come by, and I'm not one of those guys, by the way. And here's the other fun thing: some people who spend their lives speculating about this stuff can also come pretty close to getting probably a really good overarching picture. They're not going to know all the ins and outs and the details, but they might get a surprising amount right. But will they ever be able to confirm that? Maybe not. But some of these voices are worth listening to. They've got important pieces to a picture, and I suppose it's up to every one of us to try and piece this together. But yeah, most people running around in uniform in this country, even if they've got a top secret clearance, okay, unless they have a need to know something, they just don't know it. And that's just the way it is. And they're going to, hey, I'm a cook. Actually, that's a bad example. I'm an F-16 pilot or an A-10 pilot, and I've got a top secret clearance, and I don't know what on earth is going on in the Navy, and I don't know what on earth is going on in the Space Force. And, same is true in reverse.
Yeah.
That's a cynical answer.
Yeah, well, it's understandable. It's understandable.
Reality.
And we are humans as well, and we're flawed. And, if you're working on some type of top secret project or have some type of some information that shouldn't get out, they worry about people becoming, compromised and things like that. So if they only lose like 0.5% to the counterintelligence guys out there from China or whatever, then, hey, it's only 0.5% and we know where the leak is and all that stuff. So, it makes sense if you seriously think about it. One other quick question, and then we're going to start wrapping it up.
Yeah, I was getting ready to swoop in here on behalf of your wife and family, because I'm thinking he's going to start sending him text messages.
That's all right. It's all good. Whatever you got on the table, we can do like a lightning round and get through as much of this as possible. I'll try to be less verbose.
Okay, well, the last thing is, and we kind of chatted before we started recording the podcast, was about Randall Carlson, and you had him on your podcast, and he's one of my favorite people, me being a earth scientist and earth and space scientist and a teacher. And Michelle is a mythology teacher of middle schoolers and ELA. And so, he brings in some of those ancient histories and things, and you talk to him, and now you seem to show, and I don't honestly know a lot about your background, just what I've seen on your YouTube channel and things like that, and politically and what's been going on in the country. But you seem to be starting to show some interest in catastrophism. You had Randall Carlson on, so and for people out there that don't know what we're talking about, a good example of this would be like the asteroid that impacted in the Yucatan Peninsula 65 million years ago that ended basically the dinosaurs. Or you could even think more like the biblical flood, that it has some kind of story, not just in the Bible, but in over 150 other mythologies. They talk about some kind of a great flood. And then I saw and watched just the other day, you had Ben Davison on from Space Weather News, which that was a fantastic discussion. We don't pay enough attention to our sun, kind of a thing. And I think there's something locked in there with all of this stuff. And you were talking about reading Hamlet's Mill and all of this, this interest. So what has sparked your interest in that topic?
It's not a recent spark. I've studied it for about 2 decades. Now, what I'm trying to do on my show is get these guests on who have either been influential for me or something like that, to at least engage or ignite that spark of interest in others. Okay, so this is a very personal note, I suppose, but my own religious or spiritual journey has driven me to want to take interest in those things. And as I try and make sense of scripture, for example, and I don't just mean Judeo-Christian scripture, although predominantly that's what I've studied. I like the Randall Carlsons of the world and the Ben Davidsons of the world, because they actually provide some bit of a scientific underpinning for the idea of a religious catastrophist worldview. And but I'm not saying also that I'm a literalist in any sense of the I'm not saying I'm an extreme literalist when it comes to like a reading of the Bible. So while I think catastrophe is evident there, I also don't think the earth was created in 6 days. And I think it's extremely old. And I think it's occasionally absolutely devastating. And by occasionally, I speak in geological terms. It is occasionally just utterly devastated by visitors from out there. And whether those visitors are rocks or matter and energy from our sun, or even angels or gods that come, you call them aliens, you call them whatever, but we've got evidence both in the sciences, we've got evidence in ancient mythology, and we've got evidence in Judeo-Christian literature that says that we're occasionally visited here with catastrophe. And so I very much believe that. And so for me, it's just trying to piece together an accurate picture, dismissing that which is not useful, accumulating that which is useful. And I think Randall Carlson and Ben Davidson do a great job providing useful information in that regard.
Yeah, and to ignore those catastrophes that almost make the different religions and myths of the world seem like almost, I look at them as more like a history book.
It's probably
like a
right.
telling of history and the different numerologies that are embedded in there and cosmology and all of that stuff. So it's very fascinating stuff, and I really like seeing your videos that you've put out and the guests you've had on so far. So yeah, that's really cool. And I know Michelle wants to jump in here so we can wrap this up.
Yeah, I just have a question for you. If you have personally ever experienced seeing anything unknown when you were flying. I heard that giggle.
Yeah. Okay. Not while I was okay. I have seen things while I've been flying. I wouldn't characterize the things I've seen flying as, geez, there's so many things you see flying. I mean, I could file a report and make it one of the UAP reports, but nothing convinced me while I was flying in uniform for the military that I had seen a UFO or a UAP or something of an extraterrestrial origin or something that demonstrates like a transmedium travel capability or anti-gravity propulsion system or hypersonic velocities, none of that while I was in uniform. But I have had a couple of experiences outside of uniform, incidentally, that convinced me there's more there to see and understand than our military is currently overtly focused on anyway.
Do you think there's a spiritual tie? You brought up your religion in it a little bit, and I've talked to other people, and it seems like that there may be some type of a correlation between what we're seeing and the experiences we're having and people that are invested in the esoteric or more of the occult type of things. And I'm just curious, is that something you might speculate on?
Well, I guess I could reframe it. Let me ask for clarification, are you saying that those who see or experience those things are somehow seeing or experiencing them because of their own inclination towards the esoteric, or no? Is that
no?
not what you're
I'm
saying?
thinking more of there are these disembodied spiritual beings on the planet that have a way of manipulating us in like the mindset of the trickster type of archetype, or able to read what we're thinking, our energies, and then present themselves to us in that way. It's a out there theory, but
no, I can talk to it.
Okay.
All right. Now, this is the kind of thing I'll say. Now, I'm occasionally on Fox News or Newsmax, or, people still ask me to speak around the country. So the more of this I say, the less likely they are to keep inviting me back. And so maybe it's good that I say this publicly, and I can free
if
my
you don't
schedule.
want to do any more of those, right?
Here, let me say this. So I'm going to separate a couple of things that you said. As far as the spiritual or religious aspect, the idea of disembodied or spiritual entities on the earth, I will say that's a reality, and that's something I'm certain of. From personal experience, I'd say even without the personal experience, I believe in it just based on reading scripture. And that's true of every religious tradition. It's true in ancient mythological world. It's true philosophically. And but it's now we live in a very materialistic world, a secular world that wants to dismiss the idea of spiritual energies, realities, beings, and etc. But this earth is filled with spiritual realities and beings that are unseen. So I know that. Now, whether or not those beings or spirits or entities have something to do with some of the phenomena that are currently observed by our military and the craft that people are seeing, or manifestations of, one guest I recently interviewed had the theory that those beings and entities were somehow, or some cosmic consciousness were somehow manifested in Bigfoot sightings and fairies and dwarfs and all these. I don't know about any of that. I don't subscribe to that personally. I'll tell you now, though, having said what I did, what I think at the moment in, see, what's the date? September 18th, 2022, for the record, about these craft, for example. Now, I've seen a couple of things. I've seen one craft that I cannot explain. I've never seen anything before or since quite like it. It was much larger than anything I would have expected to see flying. It was middle of the night outside in the mountains, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, about 2 hours south and west of Colorado Springs. I'm not sure what it was. And it was moving very slowly, but it made noise, and it very well could have been some kind of military aircraft. I thought I knew all of the military aircraft in the inventory, and I just can't explain it. And I was with two other people who saw it, and we had no clue what it was. I've also seen a ball of energy or light that could not have been man-made, in my personal opinion, and it wasn't a fleeting experience. It lasted for, I'm guessing, memories that aren't this thing. It was over 20 years ago. It was probably a couple minute experience, and it zipped down and came close to me and took notice of me, and I took notice of it. I was with one other person there as well, and if it was close enough, my guess is I could have put my hand into it. So then people think, well, is it ball lightning? Is it? Nope, wasn't. It was very specific. It was very contained. It was energetic. It seemed conscious, and it took notice of us. We took notice of it. It zipped down. It was orange, like a giant ball of light and energy or intelligence, and then it zipped away very quickly and was gone. And boy, I was terrified, and so was the girl that I was with in the mountains of Tucson, Arizona. This was before I was married, in case my wife listens to this someday. And I can't explain that. That was before I even joined the military. So do I think those things have something to do with the spiritual beings or entities and realities all about us? Not necessarily. Both of those experiences I had were very different from one another. And some of the footage I've seen and some of the documentaries I've watched about UFOs and UAPs, I hope this doesn't disappoint anyone, but it just might. It's good to hear other people's opinions too. I think might very well be government capabilities, but not everything they're seeing. I just don't think everything that we see mankind has made. So how about that for a fuzzy summary of my view? I think that much of what we see, including, let me say a few things. The appearance of instantaneous acceleration, certainly hypersonic velocities, that's demonstrated by the United States, China, and Russia, even with larger craft, let alone small things. Transmedium travel, those kinds of things governments are potentially very capable of. Certainly hypersonic velocities. Low observability, yeah, that's something that governments are capable of reproducing. I mean, I could tell you, having operated sensors in my life, that very large things can appear very small on sensors and have a low observable footprint. And then anti-gravity, that kind of, that kind of propulsion and instantaneous acceleration, those are much harder problems to solve. And depending on the shape or appearance of some of these craft, that's a hard thing to say a government is producing those things. So how do I explain them? I can't explain them. And I'm just as curious as the next suspicious observer might be, but I'm watching as well. I'm trying to learn. But beyond those things, I'm far more interested in solving some of the ancient riddles that maybe your wife is interested in looking at. I look at what Plato's writing and the Timaeus and the Critias, and I look at that stuff.
Atlantis.
I think, there's something to that. That's a better history than it is a mythology, right?
Yeah.
So 100%. I'm with you guys on that.
All right. Well, to close things out so we can get you off to dinner, do you have any ties to Michigan? It's kind of our signature question.
Yeah, now I do.
Hey.
Now I do. Let's see. I subscribe to the Imprimus, Hillsdale College, I think somewhere down in southern Michigan.
Oh, Hillsdale.
Other than that, Hillsdale, yeah. But other than that, I don't have any ties to Michigan.
Hillsdale was in 1966, a famous UFO flap went on here.
Really?
For 2 weeks, and Hynek came out because of Gerald Ford was really mad that the Air Force wasn't investigating the UFOs that people were recording or reporting and seeing flying and landing in the area, and police officers were chasing them and everything. And then Hynek came in and said it was just swamp gas. So if you get a chance to check out the book,
okay,
Ray Szymanski, he wrote the book Swamp Gas My Ass.
Okay.
And he interviewed,
that's pretty clever.
Yeah, but he interviewed one of the pilots that were dispatched to intercept some of these things that they were detecting on radar from Selfridge Air National Guard Base. And he's got the statements, the reports. He's got the guy's former helmet. I think cool. they were flying F4s at the time. Maybe it might have been before the F4, the Phantom. I don't remember what their maybe the F-86. I don't know. It was one of the older models. And if you want a good account of that, you should check out his book. But yeah, Hillsdale. It's funny that you subscribe to their newsletter, because that was a famous thing that got shut down in '66. And that kind of started the whole culture around here in Michigan. Nobody talks about it because they were made fun of so bad. We don't talk about those things.
Amazing how long that can shape a culture or
absolutely
a climate of fear. And
yeah. And Michelle and I, after we saw a huge flying triangle. It was 300 feet on a side, hovering over the road with 3 glowing lights that were embedded in the underside of it. It just sat there. And then it rotated in place, no sound, no nothing. It wasn't casting off any light, though our eyes were detecting the light coming from the orb. They were not. It was so low, it should have been shining how bright those lights were onto the ground, and they were not shining on the ground at all. I thought it was a crashing aircraft from Detroit Metro Airport. I thought they were landing lights at first. I was a private pilot, and my dad's a retired United pilot. I've been around all kinds of aircraft. I was in the Army. I jumped out of C-130s. I was a grunt, and I had never seen anything like that. And then it rotated and moved parallel to our vehicle, and then it just disappeared.
Yeah.
It was massive. Never seen anything like that. And then we started the podcast. Well, we started our Facebook group we started getting all these reports to us about people seeing things here in Michigan. Then we started the podcast, and lo and behold, we find out there is a huge history here of UFOs in Michigan and things going on here. So, well, with that, where can people find you on the web, and where can they purchase your book if they're interested?
Sure. My book is called Irresistible Revolution. I don't think I talk about UFOs in there or any of this kind of stuff.
No, it's a totally different type of book.
If if people are interested in the first part of the book's history of the United States, I try and paint a lovely picture of that. I get into Marxist ideology, which shouldn't be politically partisan. And then I talk a little bit about what's happening in our military. And it was a bestseller last year. It's getting in the hands of a lot of people, but they can find that on Amazon for exceptionally cheap at the moment, hardback even. Or people can go to my website, MatthewLohmeier.com, and find me there. And I've got, as you mentioned, a new show. It's several months old, but the Matt Lohmeier Show on YouTube. And so if you type in Matt Lohmeier, a bunch will show up, and probably my channel will show up there as well. And I've got some good guests on the way and in the queue. And so should be some good information there. And my interests, as you could tell, are quite broad. And so I'll be interviewing all sorts of guests there in the future. So if you don't like one episode, come back for another one in the future.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm really excited to see you looking into and taking this journey about the ancient civilizations and things on your podcast on YouTube. It's really cool to watch, and I get to learn from it as well. And you got
good.
Randall Carlson on, so
he's coming back too. He
awesome.
He even reached out to me, said, "Hey, when are we doing another show?" I said,
"Oh wow,
let's do it." So, and then
just
hopefully
don't bring
Graham
up
Hancock
UFOs.
here, surely. Yeah, no UFOs. We'll talk more.
He won't talk about UFOs yet.
Well, he won't publicly.
Right. Well, okay. We'll take the hint there. Privately, he might, but
he might. But yeah,
Awesome.
hopefully Graham Hancock will be coming on to talk ancient America and some other, not related to this kind of stuff guests. Ammon Bundy, who had a standoff with the feds in Nevada and Oregon. He's running for governor of Idaho right now, and my interview with him comes out tomorrow. And
oh wow,
and Vivek Ramaswamy, a capital asset manager who's always on the news and just wrote a new book. So anyway, interesting range of guests.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Well, awesome. We will be hopefully talking to you again at some point in the future. And this has been great. It's been an honor to have you on our podcast. So I guess at this point, we're just going to say, have a good night.
Thanks. You guys too.
All right, Michelle. Well, that is one hell of an interview, if you ask me. And I think a lot of the things that were not being said was just as important as the things that were being said. How do you feel about all that?
Well, the fact that we talked about the foundation of a Space Force coming out and just kind of backtracking it back into even the Reagan eras, back during, what was it, Star Wars?
Yeah, the Star Wars weapons platform stuff about putting, nuclear weapons on space-launched platforms to basically drop nuclear missiles on the enemy. So we just didn't have the technology then.
Well, and like I said to you, had this been anyone else, during office at the time, it probably would not have, caused such wreckage in the media or the poking fun at. But
well, let's just be realistic here. I don't care what side of the aisle you fall on. Trump was a target for everything bad. I mean, everybody could not stand Trump, and he's got his downfalls and everything else. I get it. I'm always that guy that's like right in the middle. But I think the big problem the military has had with Space Force is marketing. I don't know if they got any groups together, focus groups, to look at different names about a military force that works in space, but I think that's the biggest issue, Space Force. It's just the name.
Well, and it's not like, the general public was privy to a whole lot of information as to what they were actually doing either, though.
Yeah, it's pretty clandestine. I like what he had to say about, when you have people that are speculating and guessing about what Space Force actually does, you may not be that far off, but then again, you might be. He keeps on going back and forth with that, which I thought was pretty funny, but it's also very telling. So do we have troops in the Space Force that can actually operate in outer space and do, fighting from one person to the next, like shooting people out that are out in space? Maybe they can protect the satellites. I think that's the big thing, right? Communication satellites, GPS satellites. You have to have a way to protect those assets from people like in China with their anti-satellite things flying around that can grab a satellite, and all you need to do is tap something, lightly in space and change its trajectory by just a little bit. Those things are whipping around so fast that one little movement can change a huge amount of distance on how those things operate, and easily knock stuff out of orbit. So I don't know. I thought that was really interesting when he was talking about China operating on the moon too. Like, what's going on there?
Well, the whole interview, it's like, just wonder what tidbits of information that we're going to learn that nobody else knows about.
Well, think about what he said with the sensors that they have and things like that. He wasn't aware of anything that they might have captured, but come on. If they're constantly looking at Earth from 23,000 miles away with high-powered satellites, with infrared, all those different spectrums of energy that they can look back on the Earth with, come on, they've had to see something. So that's just my thoughts. And I know he can't just come right out and say things, and I wouldn't want him to. But I don't know. He said use your imagination. You're probably not too far off. Well, I'm using my imagination and speculating. And
it's like not being of the generation where you think that it's only NASA doing everything, behind the curtain.
Well, NASA was in response to what was going on over with the Soviet Union, and their space program was Sputnik back in the day. They were the first ones to put a satellite in orbit. I don't know. I found it absolutely fascinating. I thought it was a great interview. I love the fact that if you can put your partisan politics away, whatever his views are, somebody can have some out there views, but we have a common interest, and can't we just focus and talk about that? And I'm sure people will be all upset when they just see his name as part of, being interviewed by us. But you know what? He's into things like the writings of Randall Carlson or Graham Hancock. He's a very smart dude. He has a very eclectic way of thinking with his interest, which is awesome. And, you don't have to agree with him on the politics, but he's telling the truth from his standpoint and what he saw in the military and his political leanings and his religion. And, that's his right. He can do that. And, this is still America. Imagine what the world would be like if everybody thought exactly the same. It would be absolutely horrible. So that's my 2 cents on all of that. So.
No disagreement there.
All right, Michelle, I think we should close it out for the night. The 8th graders kicked my butt all over the place this week. So I'm pretty whipped. How about you?
I'm already looking forward to Christmas break.
Absolutely.
Even Thanksgiving break, something that has more than just a couple days, because even the weekends, now this is the 2 months or month and a half of all competition time.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And, we're dealing with children right now that, if you really think about it, with COVID and everything that went on with that, they're about 2 years behind, not only academically, which they can pretty much make that up, but it's the behavior and maturity level, which I think is going to be the worst for the kids that were the youngest during the whole shutdown thing.
I don't know. My kids are getting better behaviorally. Yeah, I mean, as far as with their reading, that is still a struggle for many.
And their writing, because they were used to typing everything for 2 years for any kind of schoolwork, because it was all online.
For me, it's just, I don't want to get too much into the parenting or whatever, but a lot of the hands-off parenting, that I've got a lot of kids that are raising themselves.
Yep.
So, and it's like I become more of a mom figure to them sometimes when it comes to structure and routine.
Yeah, you bring the structure, and kids at that age love structure, right? They want to come in to your classroom, know what's going on, and, have a safe place to go ahead and learn and can expect what's going to happen in the classroom. Now, it's not always the case, but at least the kids feel that way. All right. Anyways, Michelle, let's wrap this up. I'm tired and I need to get more work done. So I think with that, we're going to go ahead and sign off.
All right, folks. Have a great night.
All right, everybody. Have a great night. And remember, keep those eyes to that sky.
You have been listening to the Michigan UFO Sightings and Paranormal Encounters podcast. You can reach us at mi.ufo.podcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Twitter at mi_UFO and join our Facebook group by searching for Michigan UFO Sightings and Paranormal Encounters. So until next time.